Hello class, I hope you are all enjoying our snow day today, and I have decided to create this video to kind of fill what we are going to do today. And before I start, I would like to say please ignore any weird sounds that my computer is making. It is kind of a dinosaur, so you're going to have to work with me. So our topic for today is Renaissance art and culture. And if you remember from the last couple of days, we were talking about humanism and specifically how the idea affected literature. Today we will discuss how it changed art and the other factors that also help art change over this time. And we will specifically focus on how these ideas differed in Northern Europe versus Italy. So how did humanism affect art? Now we have our definition from last class at the top here, which I will circle. But I want to specifically focus on this first part right here, specifically the word citizenry, and able to speak and write with eloquence. And we also talked about how there was this want of understanding humanness and how we were apply this to other people. And when we discussed medieval art in our last chapter of our book, we kind of talked about how figures were distorted, nothing seemed real. It was almost cartoonish in some ways. Hands would be facing the wrong way, just things seemed really natural. And so the idea of humanism played a role because people realized that if we are going to portray these certain humanistic aspects in our art, we're going to have to make it look more human and therefore more real and would have a better reference point for people to understand the meaning behind it. Now that wasn't the only thing that changed. To help get these natural ideas, people created this idea of linear perspective. And you look at the picture to the right, you will see exactly mathematically how this was mapped out. An artist would actually choose a spot somewhere in the middle. To be completely linear, it has to be exactly in the middle, which you will kind of see by the point that's labeled VP on the picture. But depending on where your main character in the picture was looking, you might change that, but it's going to be somewhere in the middle, and then every single line in your picture is going to go straight back to that. And that gives depth, it gives realism, and it just makes the picture look better overall aesthetically. Now, quickly going back to something I mentioned in the last slide about how medieval art and now Renaissance art changed, I wanted to physically show you what was different about them. If you look on the picture from the left, which is roughly from the 10th century, and something from the right, which is the 14th century, you can see how much things changed. While they both utilize similar colors, there's lots of blues, golds, and they are both pictures of Christ being crucified, though at different stages. Look at just the expression on people's faces. From the left, everything's kind of flat, where you can physically see wrinkles on people's faces on the right. And just on the left, people are staggered, meaning they're standing in different places, but they all look like they're relatively in the same place. Whereas you look at the people in the right, in the far left corner, or the angels at the top, they actually look like they're at different variations of distance, which was a big deal, and that goes back to the linear perspective. So this is just a good example of what things actually looked like. Now, the physical subjects, style, and what was used to make these paintings and other art changed during this time. Specifically, for paintings, oil painting became very important, as before eggs were used, but that became very old and would dry a lot faster. And once oil was used, painters realized that it would give a different effect. Now, if you look at this picture here, you will see that it specifically tells you how Italy and Northern Europe were different during these aspects. And I will give you a little hint as to why they're different, and that has to do with religion, and it also has to do with time, which we will get into in another class. Speaking of time, we know that the Italian Renaissance started somewhere in the 14th century, 15th century, depending on who you ask, and then the true Northern Renaissance didn't begin until the 16th century. So that has something to do with it. And if you look, there definitely are some similarities, but there were some known differences where Italy is known for their frescoes, whereas pretty much everything you will see for the Northern Renaissance is paintings on wood or panel. And both use linear perspective, but in different ways. The Northern Renaissance artists kind of put more attention to little details, so things like eyes. We'll see a picture of Van Eyck, which is extremely detailed. There's even a reflection in the mirror that is painting, whereas if you see an Italian Renaissance painting, it's more of the detail of the linear perspective. So everything looks scaled, but the figures might be a little less real in the sense that there's a lot of pictures of gods and goddesses and other scenes such as this, whereas in the Northern Renaissance, it was more domestic, so people just standing around in their homes doing everyday things. And one really big important thing you have to know is that in both of these places, portraits became very, very big. And this was because people started becoming more self-involved. It was no longer seen as wrong to think about yourself and how you would promote yourself. So wealthy people would hire an artist to paint them, and that painting would then stay in their house, and when other people came to visit, it was then another sign that they were wealthy. For the next couple of slides, I'm just gonna quickly go over some of the very famous paintings for both the Italian and the Northern Renaissance, so that on tests, maybe quizzes, or other assignments, you'll be able to tell me, based on the aspects we learned at the last slide, where the paintings come from, and you'll be able to tell me why, which is the more important part. So the first picture on the very left, you'll notice that we're looking at Italian Renaissance. You will see the picture that was a few slides before. And I've done this for a reason, because Giotto is very, very important to Italian Renaissance art. He is systematically chosen as the person that started linear perspective. Whether this is true or not, we probably won't ever know. But this fresco, which he did in a church, is the first known use of linear perspective in painting. And not only that, but he also used fresco, which was a very new technique for painting in churches. And it was very effective, because after this, almost everyone did it. I mean, we all know that Michelangelo painted the entire ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in that way. Now in the middle, we have Da Vinci, which he's more known for other things, but also did painting as well. And then Raphael, who did the School of Athens. And I want to point out the School of Athens because it's important to another idea with humanism. Another thing we talked about in the last couple of classes is that the humanists looked back to classical thinking. And this was true in architecture, it was true in literature, it was true in art. So this picture is literally a stylized idea of what these philosophers in ancient Athens were like. So there's Plato, there's Socrates, all of these people that might not necessarily existed together are in this one painting. Now, for this slide, I'm going to talk about just the birth of Venus, which you will see in the top left corner. And the reason I'm going to talk about this is because it's my favorite Italian Renaissance painting, but also because it just gives you a perfect depiction of what these people were thinking at the time and what was popular. This idea of Venus, even though these people were most likely hardcore Catholics, they still had this fascination with classical gods and liked what they represented. And though the linear perspective is there and things are existing where they would naturally, and as if it was a photograph, look at these people. They're all very beautiful looking. Even their clothes and the way the clothes flow off of the woman on the right are just very stylized, and you can just tell how detailed and how long it probably took. And the same is true of all of the images on this slide. Okay, so next we have the Northern Renaissance. And the first picture I'll talk about is on the very left. It is called the Arnolfini Portrait, and it happens to be my favorite Northern Renaissance painting. And the reason this is just the extreme detail of this is almost ridiculous. You can't really tell here, but if you can on your computer, focus in on the mirror in the back, you can actually see the reflection of things that are that would be outside of the window. And this is what I was talking about before, where the Northern Renaissance artists paid attention to everything. You can physically see how the dog's hairs are wiry in the foreground of the picture. And the curtains of the bed almost look real. It's almost like a photograph, but not quite, because the way people are standing isn't quite real, but it's just close enough that it's almost disturbing. It really was meant to enlighten and be enjoyed by the people looking at it. There wasn't necessarily a higher meaning that some of the Italian Renaissance artists were going for. It was simply to delight for the eye. And this changed from the medieval time because that was mostly religious art, and those were to help reinforce religious ideas. Now the next painting I'm going to talk about is on the far right. Earlier I had mentioned that portraits were really important during this time. But what was even weirder is a self-portrait. And Albrecht Dürer is one of the first artists to ever do a full self-portrait. And this kind of just shows how interested these people were in themselves, and reinforces the idea of humanism and looking at the self and trying to make the self better. But it also showed that he was, especially because he's looking at the camera, or at the viewer, I should say, that he's like, he's telling you to look at him. He's willing you to, just as if he were staring at you in real life. The last painting I would like to mention is on the left of this slide, and it's called The Ambassadors, and it's by a very important Northern Renaissance artist, Hans Holbein. And first of all, it's done with oil painting, which, as I said earlier, was really important, and it's done in wood, which I also said was important for the Northern Renaissance especially. And just like the Van Eyck painting in the last slide, you will look at just the detail of the globe. It looks like it's spinning, or the instrument that's on the lower shelf, or that kind of skull that's at the bottom of the painting that you can only see depending on where you're looking. All extremely detailed. A little skewed, but so detailed and thought out. But more importantly, this picture resembles the bigger idea of the Northern Renaissance, and then that was this everyday sort of picture. So it's just two men standing there looking pretty much right at the viewer. There's no higher meaning, there's no big idea behind it, it's just them. And this is the kind of art that people want to put in their house at this time. Just saying, we can focus on other things because we have the time, we have the mental ability to know these things because, well, we are well read, we are well traveled, which is shown by the globe. We are musical, which is shown by the instrument. We know things about astronomy, which is seen by the telescope held in the man on the left's hand. To wrap up what we just discussed, I'm going to give you some of the key points of what we discussed. Firstly, humanism played a big role in art as it did in other places during the Renaissance, and this was because people became more infatuated with everyday scenes and ideals of nature than they were with religious pictures. But it was also seen in the way people painted. It became more natural, and it went back to classical ideas because we saw gods, we saw goddesses, we saw the way the architecture looked. And then, secondly, there was a difference between Italian and Northern Renaissance art. The Italians were very, very focused on linear perspective and making everything to scale, even if their figures were a little distorted or were standing in positions that were kind of rigid and not necessarily humanistic. Whereas on the other side, the Northern Renaissance artists were extremely detail-oriented and depicted scenes of everyday life and not these grandiose pictures of gods and scenes of birth and death. And thirdly, the tools that were used to create the art changed. So instead of eggs to mix in with the paint colors, they used oil, which changed the way the strokes looked, but also was more effective and readily available and went well on a variety of mediums. And specifically in Italy, they usually did this on fresco, which is plaster, and in the north, they tended to do this on wood. Thank you for listening, and if you will now click on the link to the quiz and take it, you'll be all done for today. Enjoy the rest of your time.